Do you remember where you were on September 11th? Have you ever heard a friend or family member tell a story about an event you were allegedly a part of, but have a completely different memory of it? Did you know that you could alter somebody's memory simply by how you ask the question? On this episode of Truth Be Told, we're going to explore how easily our memory can be altered, the risks and consequences of false memories. We are joined by leading expert in memory research, Dr. Elizabeth Loftus. Please rate, subscribe, or follow our podcast as it helps for more listeners to engage with our content. And from what we're about to learn on this episode, I'd recommend doing that now. Otherwise, you'll probably forget. This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication. We are honored to be joined today by one of the nation's leading experts on human memory, Professor Elizabeth Loftus. Professor Loftus received her PhD in psychology from Stanford University, has published 20 books and over 400 scientific articles. She's been an expert witness or consultant on hundreds of cases, including the McMartin preschool molestation case, the trial of Oliver North, the trial of the officers accused in the Rodney King beating, and litigation involving Michael Jackson, Martha Stewart, Scooter Libby, and the Duke University lacrosse players. Dr. Loftus has changed the way we look at memory and statement evidence, and we hope to provide you with some takeaways on how to better interpret memory in your personal and professional lives. Welcome to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. I am honored today to be joined by Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, I'll call you the pioneer and the top dog when it comes to memory research and all things associated with that. But I'm so excited you're able to spend some time with me today, so thank you for that.
Oh, my pleasure.
I think before we get into what really I want our listeners to learn about and take away, just to kind of give a practical example, leading up to our recording this week, I was with a group of friends earlier this week, and so we're reminiscing about times like in high school and like events that happened in the classroom or like a soccer game that we had played and something that happened after the game. And I started thinking, is that even real? Like what I'm remembering happened 25 years ago or 30 years ago, is that even accurate? And I think as people are listening, they probably have family reunions and holidays where you get together and you reminisce about old times. So to kind of kick us off, what's the likelihood that that memory is actually accurate?
I think you can come up with a number. There's not going to be like a 2% or a 68% number. But one of the things that you learn when you reminisce with people, you you go to a high school reunion, you can experience this for yourself, that people will remind you of things that or remember things differently from the way you did, or sometimes remember them somewhat similarly, and you'll share those experiences. Um, but I'm not sure that anybody can give you just some number. It's
Right.
going to depend on how long ago it was, and all kinds of other factors that could affect the accuracy of what somebody is saying.
And that's what I'm so interested to help our listeners learn from your research is those factors are incredible to me, right? Everything from maybe the emotions around the event to how the question was phrased about the memory in the first place to how many times have you maybe repeated that memory. And so I think it's really interesting how that can impact it.
Well, there's so many factors that affect the accuracy and completeness of somebody's memory that that it fills an entire book when you're writing about the field.
What got you interested in this field in the first place? Such a unique thing to explore. What made you passionate about understanding memory?
A ways back, I was doing some studies of memory, some a different kind of memory. I was studying people's memories for words and language, their knowledge of the world, not the personal episodes of their life. So knowing that Buffalo is a city in New York, or that the weather in Buffalo is really cold, or in the winter, that would be an example of semantic memory. And I was doing these studies and kind of learning how to become an experimental psychologist. And at some point along the way, I thought, I really would love to work on a memory issue or some issue that had more practical relevance, more practical applicability, be of greater interest to people beyond just the immediate sub area of psychology in which I work. And so there I was. I knew something about memory, but how about I've always had an interest in legal issues and the law and justice. And so, how about looking at memory for crimes and accidents and other legally relevant events? And then in the 1970s, I'd already gotten my PhD. I was out there in the academic world teaching. I decided to shift my attention a little bit to those kinds of memories, eyewitness memory.
Yeah, which I know our listeners have heard a lot of guests as we talk about kind of investigative interviews. We've talked a little bit about wrongful convictions, and we know that eyewitness misidentification is one of the leading causes of wrongful convictions. But I think that's probably eye-opening for most people because a layperson probably thinks, and I would have thought, I'm pretty good memory. I remember what somebody was wearing that I saw this morning at the Starbucks, or I remember a car accident that I witnessed last week. And your research has shown us that maybe that's not as accurate as we might think.
Right. And well, I love to talk about the wrongful conviction data. I mean, usually I'll open, one of my new classes with that kind of information, like the data from the Innocence Project in New York, where that shows uh, the very high rate of wrongful convictions are being caused by faulty human memory, faulty eyewitness testimony, identifying the wrong person when you've actually been a witness or a victim of a crime. But eyewitness memory in legal cases, comes up in all kinds of other cases besides just, is that the guy who did it? So in civil cases, you have situations where eyewitness testimony puts the accident on one side of the road and physical evidence says no, the accident occurred on the other side of the road. So what are you supposed to do with that? Medical malpractice cases where there's a dispute in memory between what the doctor told the patient and what the patient says or remembers hearing from the doctor. Financial fraud cases where a customer says the broker promised something and the broker says, I never made that promise. I mean, I can go on and on with the kinds of situations that are very important in our legal system where disputed memory is an issue.
Yeah, I think let's dive into that a little bit. I know there's probably not a number, or if there is a number, you'd be the one to know it. But I'm curious first for our listeners, when you have a conflict or a contradiction between two people remembering an event. So maybe it's what the broker said versus what the customer said, or it's two people that witnessed a workplace accident. How much of that do you think is intentional contradiction? I know there might not be a number, but maybe a better way to ask this: is there a situation where maybe there's a contradiction in us telling the events, but it's not intentional? It's completely based off of our own kind of memory fallibility.
Of course, people can lie, and accusers can lie about what happened to them for one reason or another. People being accused can certainly lie and deny that they committed an act when they really did. I mean, we know that lying happens, and there are psychologists who study lying, and basically what they'll tell you is that we all lie, and we all lie a lot more than we think. And you might read a study that says people lie 5 times a day. Um,
Right.
and often they're just white lies, oh, your haircut looks really nice, when in fact it doesn't look that nice, but you want to make a person feel good. But the work that I do and that many other scientists in the eyewitness field do is work that shows that very, very often people are not deliberately lying. It is not a big fat lie when they say that's the guy. They honestly believe it. And in fact, in many legal situations, it's often a better strategy, especially if you have a genuine victim that you think is mistaken, and you want to show some kind of empathy or sympathy for that victim, but you believe that there are errors in their memory, it's a lot kinder to kind of suggest that maybe they have a distorted or false memory, which they may well have, than to call them an out and out liar.
Do you think that and this got to be a difficult balance, and I know you've provided expert testimony in this field. It's got to be a difficult balance if somebody feels like they were either victimized or whether it's a criminal or a civil case, and they're remembering an event, but there's a chance that their memory was wrong, right? So how do you balance, I guess, representing the complainant and what they remember, but also qualifying their memory as maybe they're not remembering it exactly correct at the same time?
Well, since the work that I do is so much focused on, the errors people make and when they make them or why they make them, or who is likely to make them, usually usually I'm being called in a legal case where somebody is disputing somebody else's memory. I'm not going into a case and saying, I believe this memory is real and you should believe the person and find the guy guilty. That's not the kind of role that I've played in the various opportunities I've had to be involved in legal cases. Generally, there's somebody who's got a pretty good reason to be questioning the memory, and they may want some information about how memory works that can help them understand what could have happened in this case.
I've had that's interesting because I've had some cases where I provided expert testimony specific to like police interrogation practices or false confessions. And what's interesting is when I look at the case, and you might have one where you're looking at the entire investigation, thinking, okay, innocence or guilt, but then you have to realize, as an expert, that's not what I'm focused on. I'm focused on the science and the reliability of the evidence specifically to what I'm talking about, right? And trying to ignore the rest. Do you ever have that kind of internal conflict where you're representing the science and not necessarily the outcome of the case, like you just mentioned?
I completely understand what you're saying, but I'm not quite sure, what part of it to respond to. I see what you mean. I mean, I'm looking at the memory issue, and if somebody says to me, well, what if I told you that the accused fingerprint was found, at the scene? Would that change your feeling about how accurate the witness's memory was? And I said, well, I don't know. Somebody else can analyze the fingerprint
Right.
evidence. I'm interested in the conditions which might or might not be accurate. It could be real, could be planted, could be a mistaken conclusion or whatever.
Right.
I'm just interested in what could have affected the memory of the eyewitness. So I try to separate myself from when I get thrown a question like that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was that's what I was going for. It's the same thing as making sure, you know, I think a lot of people don't understand what the role of an expert sometimes is. It's not to persuade on one side of innocence or guilt or truthful or untruthful. It's the reliability of that specific piece of information that's being presented, which is I think is really really interesting. And for our listeners, we've got a lot in the private sector, so they might conduct interviews of employees, right? Employee relation issues. Maybe there was an argument or a disagreement, or maybe an accident. And you mentioned accident earlier, and I know some of your foundational research that things have been kind of built off of is kind of the paradigm that you built with people witnessing a potential car accident. Maybe you obviously can explain it better than I can, but give our listeners a little kind of foundation to what that research was about.
Well, it might interest you that the only reason that you saw a lot of accidents in my, early work on eyewitness memory is because I knew a professor when I was in graduate school at Stanford. He was a professor, and he went to work for the Department of Transportation, the U.S. Department of Transportation. And after I had gotten my degree and I was out of grad school and I wanted to study eyewitness memory, I ran into him, had occasion to meet him. And I said, I think I want to study eyewitness memory, for accidents, crimes, and other legal events. He said, well, if you study accidents, I am part of the division at the Department of Transportation that gives out research money for the study of accidents. And we have money for good research on accidents. So if because of the opportunity to get a research grant from the Department of Transportation, I said, sure, I'll show people films of accidents rather than films of something else. And that's how it all got started. But really, the kinds of conclusions that I would reach in that early work really apply to memory for all kinds of complex, rich events of our past.
Yeah, that's well, thankfully that relationship helped kind of change the landscape of how we look at memory from investigations to everything else. That's really neat. And I'm sure access to data was helpful too, of trying to get films. So I guess to explain to the listeners some of the foundational research you had participants watching video clips of real traffic accidents.
Right. I back in those days, I borrowed films from, driver training schools and maybe police training. They were kind of training films, and I borrowed them and used them in my experiments. At some point, one of my star undergraduates was the son of an FBI official. So I managed to get some films of bank robberies
Mm,
that were used for training purposes. But back in the beginning, I was borrowing films and creating stimulus materials from those borrowed films.
right. That's really neat. Well, so if we look at that, and I know there was different that research evolved, right? Because there was questions that as in any research, there's more questions that you create after you've already done one study and look at different limitations and what other variables were in at play. So, what was maybe the initial goal in this kind of accident paradigm, and how did that evolve from one study to the next?
Okay, so there I was. I made the decision that I wanted to look at memory for something that had more practical applicability. I decided upon eyewitness memory. Um, but what factor did I want to study? There were so many things that could affect it. Was I going to look at how far away the witness was? How good the lighting was, how much time elapsed, um, what kind of stress level the witness was under. I could have picked any one of these things. Um, but I got very interested in the questioning process. So that's how I started this work. How would the questions that you put to a witness affect what the witness told you they remembered? And so in one of my early studies, we showed people filmed accidents, and we would ask a question like, "Well, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other?" Or for other witnesses, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? And what we found is that just changing a word or two in the question could affect the answer somebody gave you. They told us the cars were going faster if we used the word smash than if we used the word hit. So that was one of my first, excuse me, observations that the wording of a question can affect the answer a witness gives you. But then we went further. We did another study where we did that first phase, showed people an accident, asked them either the hit question or the smash question, and then brought them back a week later and said, that accident we showed you last week, did you see any broken glass? Well, there was no broken glass in the film. The right answer should have been no. But people who'd been asked the smash question were over twice as likely to tell us they had seen broken glass compared to people who had been asked the hit question. So now we knew something more. We knew that those early questions were affecting the answer somebody gave to a later question. And I began to argue that what those early questions are doing are actually altering somebody's memory. So that the smash question is making you think the accident was more severe, the speed was higher, and since broken glass is commensurate with a severe accident, one that occurred at high speeds, more likely to say, yes, I saw this broken glass that didn't exist. And so, that's just a bit of early work, but there have been so many other examples now of how leading questions, but not just leading questions, other sources of post event suggestion can actually alter somebody's memory.
I think that we can explore all of that because it's so fascinating, and I can imagine how exciting the research was when you were doing it to see the findings. My first question is, do you feel like that has a lasting effect? So what I mean by that is, if we'll go with the smash and the hit, two different groups. If those same people, and maybe I'm asking a question there's not an answer to yet, I don't know, but if those same people got asked 10 years later, hey, remember that accident that you saw, a decade ago? Do you remember what that was like? Do you think there's still that? Does their memory continue to change and supported their initial recollection from that contamination?
Well, I don't know about 10 years later. I mean, of course, some people are going to say, really, I'm not sure I really remember it at all. Yeah,
Right.
no matter what. But if they do continue to, be reminded of the memory, I mean, I think they're going to be reminded of a memory that's more severe than it actually was. That becomes their memory.
Right.
And when they tell you about it, they're telling you something that they honestly believe they experienced.
Would it be fair to kind of, if I generalize that research and thinking about some of our listeners, so let's say there's an incident of workplace violence, or maybe even patrol officers are responding to a domestic violence call. If there was an argument between two people, but there's a leading question like, hey, how hard did you witness Dave hit that guy in the face versus what did you happen to see? That same concept. Can we generalize it to these other types of investigations that our word choice may contaminate or alter somebody's memory?
Absolutely. If you refer to something as a fight versus an incident in your question, it could potentially affect how people reconstruct what they experienced.
What about witness contamination? So I'll go with that with this the same example of a car accident. So if I'm not watching film, if I'm actually witnessing a car accident, that means maybe I was the car behind the car at the red light or the the stop sign or whatever. So I get out of the car, make sure everybody's okay, and as we call the first responders to make sure they come to the scene, of course, three of us are standing there chatting about the weather and about the day before the police get there, and we're probably talking about what we just saw. Is there research around that kind of witness contamination or how that might impact what I then tell the police when they finally get there?
No, that scenario you just described, I mean, something very similar happened to me. I was like in a grocery store where kind of a robbery happened. Before the police even arrived, all the people in the store were talking about it and sharing information about what they saw and what they experienced. So the potential there for, as in your scenario, for contamination before any questions are asked or answered from law enforcement is very real. And one of the things that maybe I'll mention is, even though I started by looking at leading questions and how they could alter what people tell you and alter the memory, I would soon begin to see these as just one form of post-event misinformation that can contaminate memory. And the sharing of information amongst witnesses who had a shared experience is another source of post-event contamination. Uh, Media coverage, especially if it's a high publicity event, and now people are being interviewed, and interviewers are presenting information on television, on the internet, uh, in other public places. Another source of potential post-event information, if it's misleading, can contaminate the memory of others.
So I guess from what you just said too, I would imagine we could probably draw a conclusion that the potential spread of misinformation has got to drastically impact people's memory, right? We have information so quickly now on social media that a witness, before being interviewed about something, may have seen 15 different headlines defining it before they're ever questioned about it.
That happens. The other, another thing that is a sort of a result of modern technology is people go on the internet and start to do their own research. Um, there's one somewhat well-known case where there was an assault and um, on a woman, and the husband comes home and says, "I think that's my ex-girlfriend." And they go on the internet, they start to look for pictures of the ex-girlfriend, and the victim says, "Yeah, I think that's who came to the door and assaulted me." And lo and behold, she's now the defendant. Well, uh, it's not exactly an unbiased six-pack.
Right. Right. Well, and I'm thinking even to our earlier example, like my kind of hypothetical at a class reunion or something, is if somebody in our little group talks about this great play somebody made at the football game or something, and everybody else probably would start to think, well, if they're saying it, I was there, I guess that's what happened, and then they might internalize that, and then that becomes their story, and now you've got three people telling the same story, which makes it feel more credible, but it all came from the same unreliable source in the first
Yeah,
place.
that's how it happens.
Yeah. Do you feel, or have you seen in the research that other kind of situational or maybe environmental type factors play a role in memory? What I mean by that, and maybe I'm defining it wrong, but emotion, maybe trauma, maybe the recency of the event, those types of things. Can that play a factor in how accurate we're recalling information?
Well, there are factors that come into play at every stage of this process. So there are factors that come into play at the time of the event itself. Some obvious ones, like how good the lighting is and how far away you are, and are there obstacles to your perception. There are factors after the event is over. One obvious one is how much time has passed before you're asked to remember something. Um, what's a little less obvious is, was there contaminating or distorting information in that period of time that could have contaminated a witness's memory? Then you have the period of time where somebody is trying to tell you what happened. They're answering questions, they're testifying, uh, or they're just telling in their own words what they remember to a police officer. And here, additional factors can come into play. So our job as researchers in this field is to identify those factors and to examine uh, how they matter and when they matter.
I've seen, speaking of those, a couple of those that you just mentioned, I've seen and or heard, I guess, sleep cycles after maybe a traumatic event. So whether somebody's interviewing, like after an officer involved shooting, or after somebody's a victim of a traumatic event, that their memory may or may not be better if they've gone through two sleep cycles before the interview takes place. Or any thoughts or around that
Um,
research?
I don't, I know that's controversial. And I haven't like sort of dived into what small bits of research might exist to help sort that out. But I'd ask another expert, because all other things being equal, the information you get closest to the event is more likely to be accurate.
Right.
So if there's something else, going on that says, well, if you let them sleep for a while, obviously that increases the retention interval, so the memory fades over time. Is there something else that's better? I'm going to let other people in the field duke that one out.
Yeah, that's fair. I know that's why I asked, because I kind of you hear a lot on both sides of that. I'm not really sure, and of course, from an investigative space, urgency can be really a vital factor depending on the type of case. But you also want to make sure that you're respecting the person that you're talking to, so there's a balance there. The
There are a number of areas where there's controversy. It's not only that one, but another one I came across recently is the idea of body worn cameras on the part of law enforcement. Do you let the officer review the tape before they write their report, or do they write their report before they review the tape? A lot of discussion about which is the better procedure.
Yeah, I've seen. It's interesting. I've seen that because you've got this conflict between, are you trying? What's the intent, right? Are you trying to catch somebody and a contradiction? Is the body cam also going to create a bias based on the perspective of the camera recording and what they remember, and they're just going to
Yeah.
be compliant to the recording? Yeah, it is interesting. The other, I guess, I don't want to call it a myth because it could be based on research, but we see this also in the cognitive interviewing is kind of recreating the context for somebody when they're trying to recall an event. And what I'm trying to communicate by that is like all the different senses that might appear or be existing when the event is initially encoded. Does that make it easier to recall? So if a smell, for example, I walk into a house and a certain smell reminds me of my grandma's house and I remember it right away, what are we experiencing there? Or is that even accurate, right? Does the
Uh,
context of those
well,
senses matter?
lots of things can serve as a retrieval cue and can remind you of something. Um, and there are certainly scientists who believe that if you reinstate the context of an experience, you'll get better memory. But it's not always. It, it doesn't always work very well. I mean, sometimes context effects are very minimal and somewhat fleeting.
Right. So if I'm studying for a test and light a vanilla candle and chew wintergreen gum, it doesn't mean I'm going to do better on the test if I recreate the same scenario when I take it.
No, I remember when I was, teaching context effects and, in a large survey course that I was teaching a couple of decades ago at my prior university, a student who was going to be taking the graduate record exam decided she would sit in a particular room where the exam was
Mm.
going to be given and study there because she thought that would help her do better on the exam. And every day she went to this empty big classroom, sat there and studied. And on the day of the test, when she showed up, there was some problem with the room, leaky roof or something. They had moved the
Oh no.
exam, to a different room. So it threw her off.
Yeah. So results are pending on that study.
Right. And I'm
Yeah.
not sure how much that would have helped her.
That's interesting. Yeah. I've also kind of talking about whether myths or reality, I guess, when it comes to memory. I've read a lot on the concept of kind of these flashbulb type memories, or I think the easiest one for most people to think about is I remember where I was on 9/11, or I remember what I was wearing that day, or these kind of significant events. And I've seen some conflicting there where it makes sense because flashbulb meaning everything kind of froze at that time and you remember it, or is it because we feel like we have to remember it and we feel like we have to have a story, and that's where we come up with that. But any thoughts or knowledge of what the research is like with those incidents?
Well, the flashbulb memory, I think that term might have been coined by Roger Brown at Harvard. And he was thinking, I think, at that time about um, people who remembering where they were on when they heard the news of the Kennedy assassination.
Mm.
So it turns out that that was pretty long ago now, but many, many, many people who were over the age of 8 at the time of the Kennedy assassination, and I'm one of them, can tell you something about where they were when they heard the news. And then people started talking about uh, 9/11 or the Challenger explosion or if you're doing flashbulb memory studies in other countries, where were you when you heard the news that Princess Diana was killed in a tunnel in France? Uh, Different countries have their own flashbulb events. But when researchers have studied these events, by asking people like shortly afterwards, write out exactly where you were when you learned about this event, and then they come back to them a year or two later, tell me again exactly where you were. The stories change often. Often they'll say, well, I was in a dorm room and my roommate came in and said, did you hear what just happened? And 2 years later, they're saying, I first learned about it when I turned on the TV. So, what we've learned from this research is even these kinds of memories are malleable and can change for a number of reasons.
Yeah, have
But
you
in
ever?
my case, I still have pictures of what I was
Well,
doing the day I learned
you have
about
proof,
the
evidence.
assassination. I was on my way to the Yale Harvard game to
Yeah.
watch the football game, which when I landed in New York and my date picked me up, he said, "Did you hear what just happened? Our president's been shot." And now I said, "Oh no, I hope it's not serious."
Right.
And then everything fell apart. And the game got canceled, postponed, and
Well, I was just going to ask you, and with your research, we get asked this question a lot. We train police on investigative interviewing and private sector, and so often people ask, like, how much does that questioning and the way you're training impact your personal life? Like, do you carry that in? And so for you, I'm wondering, does it make it? Do you always have to second guess yourself when you're thinking about a memory, or somebody, a colleague of yours is sharing about something that happened a decade ago? Does the research in your head kick in and you already have this doubt, or are you able to kind of turn that off and just listen to a story?
well, there are a few ways that I think that my work has affected my kind of day to day or week to week or month to month life. I mean, I read about an accusation in the paper, and what it's in the paper, people are talking about it. Often they want to find the accused person guilty. They want the guillotine, before trial. And I'm sitting here saying to myself, I wonder if this is a false accusation. I wonder if this is really real. So sometimes I feel a little out of step with my fellow citizens. And that's a bit discomforting. But I think a more valuable lesson that I've learned from the work that I've done and many other scientists who do similar kind of work is that when a friend or a family member or even I myself make a mistake and say something that I think is not accurate, I don't immediately assume that they're a big fat liar. I mean, they could have a false memory. I'm wondering why they do. But it's a much kinder way to feel about the people around you. So I think that's kind of a good lesson. I certainly know and have learned that when my own memories have been questioned by other people, it's very uncomfortable for me. And I'm
Right.
very kind of relieved when I get the proof that
Right.
I had the accurate memory. I mean, I had this experience during COVID. The New Yorker had a profile article about me and my work on memory distortion. And they interviewed a couple of people I knew who had different memories from me. And I was irked by that. And one of the memories was fairly important. It had to do with the death of my mother. And when the author of this article found proof that my memory was right, I felt relieved. But it made me appreciate why maybe some people are angry with me or my work when I'm questioning their memory. People don't like to have their memories questioned. It doesn't feel comfortable. But sometimes it has to be done, or you end up creating new victims, falsely accused victims.
That's a great perspective. I think I read that article. They might have. I think they did. They talk about the Weinstein case a little bit in that.
Well, it may open with Weinstein. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what you just said makes a lot of sense, right? Because it feels like you're being called a liar, right? When you think you remember something and you are remembering with good intent, and somebody says, "I don't think that's how it went." That can be. And what's really interesting is hearing it from you. So the person who would know the most about how fallible memory can be would still feel a little defensive if your memory was questioned. And that's just, we take that personal because that's it's our autobiography in our head of how we remember events. And so that takes me to one other topic here. I've seen some maybe thoughts or suggestions around therapeutic type interventions where almost planting false memories. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but changing the way somebody remembers an event to help them overcome some of these negative events in their life. Maybe you can explain what that is, and is there controversy around that, or if you have thoughts around that
Well,
modality.
Dave,
Okay.
I have many thoughts about
Okay.
that.
Share them.
So after I had been spending maybe, nearly 2 decades working on eyewitness memory and wrongful convictions and the factors that cause people to identify the wrong person, I had been an expert in some murder cases or robbery cases. I started to see a very new and even more peculiar memory phenomenon When individuals were going into therapy, maybe they had one kind of problem. They were anxious, they were depressed, they had an eating disorder, and they went into therapy and they ended up with a therapist who helped convince them that they were sexually traumatized for years by someone close to them, and that they had repressed their memories and that these memories needed to be recovered in order for them to heal themselves from these symptoms. And so I started to see these accusations because many of these patients sued their parents, their other relatives, their former neighbors, or whoever, claiming this massive trauma and repression of memory. And when I began to look at what was going on in the therapy, I was kind of stunned because there were all kinds of suggestive things going on, all kinds of suggestive guided imagination and suggestive dream interpretation, and sometimes hypnosis and other things that we would learn can really contaminate a person's memory and create entirely false memories in the minds of otherwise ordinary, healthy people. After participating in a bunch of lawsuits where people were suing their alleged abuser after they recovered what they thought were repressed memories, some of these patients started to realize their memories were false. And they then sued their therapist for planting false memories. And that was all a new collection of court cases.
Jeez.
So there was a lot going on in the 90s and into the 2000s in what we now refer to as the period of the memory wars.
Interesting. Is there, so if you flip that script, and maybe this is part of the controversy of where that has evolved into, is there therapeutic methods out there that you're aware of where people are trying to take negative experiences and create a false memory to almost to repress that intentionally, or make something that maybe was bad in the past, but try to help them remember that in a more positive way? So it's almost flipping the memory, the opposite of what you just suggested.
Well, there was a famous therapist named Erickson who it's been so long since I read about his work on this, who did, occasionally try to convince a patient that something that to give a more positive spin on something they were feeling negative about. Um, you know, uh, in some cases, who knows? Maybe that would be helpful for a person. Um, at least it's not something that is going to, if not true, it's not something that's going to harm some innocent person. Maybe it would be helpful to get people to modify their memory and change their behavior if it can help them live a happier or healthier life. That's something, we can at least ponder and think about.
I
Is
think
that the kind of world we would like to live in?
right. It sounds on its surface deceitful. Like I'd rather know the accuracy and reliability of what happened and deal with that head on. And the reason I asked that, and really kind of ties in everything we've talked about, is it just to me shows how easy, maybe even unintentionally, we can alter or contaminate somebody's memory by the way we ask the questions, when we ask the questions, what kind of other post contamination they had. It can just be altered in so many different ways, for good or for bad.
Well, but I can add to this though. You don't need external contamination. People can distort their own memories, called autosuggestion. And so there's research out there, a lot of research that'll show, for example, that people remember that on their own. They remember their grades were better than they really were. They gave more to charity than they really did, or their kids walked and talked at an earlier age than they really did, or they voted in an election that they didn't vote in. These are prestige enhancing memory distortions that maybe allow us to feel a little better about ourselves. I mean, assuming we don't get caught in a big fat inconsistency that then causes a reputational problem for us. But maybe this lets us feel a little bit better about ourselves And there was some older work that showed that depressed people didn't do this so much. That's why those researchers called those depressed people sadder but wiser.
Right. Right. Ignorance is bliss, I guess. So the more truth we tell ourselves, the more we can pretend we had a positive impact on the world around us.
Yeah, it might not always be such a bad thing.
Right.
I mean, I we once did a study where we showed that if you plant a memory that you got sick eating a particular fattening food, people don't want to eat it as much. That seems like kind of a good thing.
That's
If you plant a warm, fuzzy memory about a healthy food like asparagus, people are more interested in eating asparagus. So you might be able to use these false memory ideas to plant memories that can allow people to live a healthier life.
right. What
Would
an
that be
interesting
so
concept.
bad?
Right. Yeah. Instead of remembering the pain of running a marathon, you try to remember the joy of finishing it. And it keeps you. It's kind of like when I attempt to play golf, I try to forget how many times I hit a tree and I remember that one good shot I had and what that felt like, and I want to go back again. It's the
Okay, well,
same.
there you go.
Right. I'm still
Yes.
not good at it, but I'll use that
I'm
in when I tell
I'm
the story.
terrible at it. Yeah. I'm okay at ping pong though.
There you go. As we, because I want to be respectful of your time, and as we wrap up, this has been fascinating. I mean, I think I could talk to you for hours and ask questions about this topic. So I think it impacts so much of our everyday life outside of just investigations. Um, but a couple just last questions to kind of wrap up for people. One, we do have a lot of researchers that listen, and a lot of academics kind of in their early stages of their career. Any suggestions or advice when if they're either entering this space or a different space? But I know this one, there's a lot of controversy around memory as you discussed, because there's so much feels like personal attack if somebody's memory is wrong. So I'm sure you've dealt with a lot of obstacles in your career, but any advice for young researchers going into kind of areas like this?
I I think I don't know, learning the scientific method, learning you know, what it means to be an experimental psychologist, being able to do uh, good experiments and under good conditions is something that's going to serve you not only in the profession but in helping you evaluate claims that other people are making. Um, I might add this is a little bit different, but in the early years, I was publishing my work only in mainstream kind of scientific journals that where other psychological scientists would read. And at some point, I decided to write about some of this work in a popular magazine. It happened to be Psychology Today magazine, which at the time had a circulation of, I think, over 1 million. Lots of people read it, not just people interested in psychology who were in the field, but law enforcement and members of the legal profession. And it was that article that caught the attention of lawyers, where I then, got invitations to uh, give speeches at legal conferences or consult on court cases. So if you're interested in not only doing your work in a laboratory situation in a college or university setting or wherever you're doing that work, but you're also interested in outreach and being out there in the real world, that's one step to take that doesn't take all that much effort.
I think that's great advice, and that's partly. And I told you this before we started recording, but reaching out to you not just because of the incredible work you've done from the research standpoint, but of how passionate you've been to make sure that research changes the legal system and informs practitioners, and that's really where the podcast and kind of our whole theme comes in, is how can we take research and apply it and make a difference in the world. So I appreciate that and your time today. The last question I have for that is just more of a for people, just lay people listening, not investigators, but they may sit on a jury. They are going to sit with their family over the holidays or over an event. They're going to talk about memories. They're going to tell themselves that they voted in an election. Is there any advice or just thought process that you want people to walk away with on just how to be maybe more aware of what we just talked about?
I did a TED talk. It's now like 10 years ago, But I wanted to leave that audience with a kind of a take-home message, and it's still so perfect now. And so what I said back then and what I would say today is that just because somebody tells you something and they say it with a lot of detail and they express a lot of confidence in what they're saying and they show emotion when they're telling you, it doesn't mean that it happened that way. False memories can have those very same characteristics. They can be detailed, confident, and emotional. So you really need to think a little more deeply, ask whether there is any independent corroboration for what's being claimed in order to know whether you're dealing with an authentic memory or one that's a product of some other process.
The perfect takeaway. And my personal takeaway is always second guess, maybe don't assume, but also don't assume ill intent, right? It could be just a natural memory fallibility and doesn't mean that somebody's, as in your words, a big fat liar. So I think that's a great takeaway.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. I know it's busy time of year for you, so I appreciate you spending some time with me, and for our listeners, I got a lot out of it. So I appreciate that, and good luck keeping doing what you're doing.
Okay, thank you. Nice to be with you.
Yes, you too. This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication.